Well, hey, everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. Now, Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe since 1980, is a landlocked country in Southeast Africa. Now, from 1978 to 1980, Rhodesia experienced one of the largest anthrax epidemics in recorded history. And this led to the deaths of hundreds and caused significant economic devastation. Now, the epidemic happened during the Rhodesian Bush War. To this day, the origins of this devastating outbreak remain highly controversial. Was it the result of an endemic outbreak or a case of biological warfare? Still a question. Now, today I'm going to look at the history of the epidemic and the possible causes with Matthew Turner, MD. Dr. Turner is with the Department of Emergency Medicine at Penn State Health, Milton S. Hershey Medical Center in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And he's also the author of an article on the topic published in the Cureus Journal of Medical Science. And there it is right there. And let me bring him on.
Hey, Dr. Turner, great to be here.
Dr. Turner, so glad to have you here. Before we dive into the actual paper, it's a very fascinating history. What prompted you to want to write an article about the Rhodesia anthrax epidemic?
Well, I've always been interested in the intersection of medicine and history. And I recently stumbled across the book Dirty War, Rhodesia and Chemical Biological Warfare, 1975 to 1980, which was an excellent history of biochemical weapons in the Rhodesian Bush War by Dr. Glenn Cross. I believe that you mentioned that you had spoken with him earlier. You've had him on the show before. He's a phenomenal researcher, and it's a very interesting history. However, even with recent publications such as Dr. Cross's work, this war and the use of biological and chemical weapons in it, it's a pretty not very well known footnote in history. I think that it really deserves more attention as there's a lot that can be learned from it, especially in our increasingly unstable world.
So let's start and give the audience, because I'm sure not a whole lot of people are aware. Can you give a little introduction of the Rhodesian Bush War and discuss the use of chemical and biological weapons during this time in history?
Of course, so the Rhodesian Bush War, it's a very long and complicated struggle. It actually had three distinct factions that at multiple points all warred against one another. This conflict started in the British colony of southern Rhodesia, what is now known as Zimbabwe. So, as a part of the British Empire's decolonization process after the Second World War, London demanded that all of its African colonies switch over to majority African rule before they could be granted independence. In the vast majority of cases, this went well. They did this effectively in a number of colonies. Unfortunately, the African colony of southern Rhodesia, also usually just known as simply Rhodesia, heavily resisted this. The white minority population, which was something like 6% of the population, absolutely refused to give up any sort of political or economic power. Ultimately, this came to a head in 1965 when Rhodesia issued the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, declared independence from the British Empire. Now, to make a very long and complicated story short, this led into a three-way civil war within Rhodesia. You had Rhodesian security forces, the Zimbabwe African People's Revolutionary Army, and the Zimbabwe African People's Union. This was a very prolonged, brutal guerrilla conflict that lasted about 14 years. So in the early stages of the war, it actually went quite well for Rhodesian security forces. They had a small army, but it was very well funded and highly professional, had a robust intelligence network, and a lot of support from South Africa. And at one point, Rhodesian forces were some of the best in the world at guerrilla and counterinsurgency operations. However, by 1978, the tide had turned. They had strict international sanctions that were crippling their economy. They had a severe manpower shortage, and the resources were rapidly running low. So the Rhodesian state began to resort to more cruel and unconventional tactics. There was something they did called Operation Turkey, where they effectively deliberately starved their own people. Like a lot of African rural farmers, they reduced to meal cards and rations. Only 1 day supply of food at a time could be granted to the population. They would also deliberately flood civilian stores with like booby-trapped radios in an attempt to flush the guerrillas out. So it was in this period, um, in my research and Dr. Cross's work, that Rhodesian forces began to turn to biological and chemical weapons. They used cholera, warfarin, and even like organophosphates, such as um, those found in pesticides. And ultimately, they killed hundreds of guerrillas that way. Most of this was done using a parathion, which is a type of organophosphate that you can find in pesticides. They would deliberately poison clothing, leave clothing out in civilian stores that guerrillas would ultimately steal from, poison people that way. But unfortunately, this also led to hundreds of civilian casualties as well. Lots of crimes against humanity at this point. It was a very brutal conflict.
All right. So on this podcast, anthrax has been a topic a number of times. So can you give us just a short summary about anthrax, the agent itself?
So anthrax, the agent itself, it's actually endemic to southern Africa. So it was endemic to Rhodesia for centuries before this. It's a type of bacterium. It can exist as a spore in the environment, and actually it can last in the environment for decades. Typically, you'll see it most often in grazing animals, specifically cattle. Animals such as cows eat the spores, it will replicate within the host and eventually kills the host. Most of the time, human infection actually comes from consuming meat or using hide products from the infected animal, which then act as contaminants for humans. But because of its persistence in the environment for decades, its toughness, and it's very easy to disseminate, it's actually been an effective agent for possible bioweapon use. It's actually been considered as a military weapon for decades. The British Empire maintained a stockpile of over 5 million anthrax cakes during the Second World War. The German Empire actually used it to some small extent in the First World War in attempting to poison cattle in various neutral countries. And multiple other nations have experimented with anthrax and maintained stockpiles as well.
Okay, so let's talk about the magnitude of this epidemic. I mean, it was really, really huge, right? I mean,
Oh, absolutely.
for anthrax, something that's not typically person to person.
Correct. So this was the largest confirmed anthrax epidemic in recorded history. There might have been a larger anthrax epidemic in Haiti in the 1790s during like the Haitian Wars for Independence, but it's very unclear if that's was truly anthrax or some other disease.
Mhm.
But in Rhodesia, at the very height of the war in 1978, we have the largest anthrax epidemic in history. It was massive, sudden, and came out of absolutely nowhere. In 1977, the year before, we went from having 0 cases of anthrax to the next year having 17,000 human cases, hundreds of human fatalities, and millions of cattle infected. This was incredible in its scope.
Yeah. Now, part of the debate here is, was this natural or was this a bioweapon? Um, what are the various theories and evidence, both for and against the use of a bioweapon, anthrax as a bioweapon?
Well, so I'll start with the evidence for. There is a lot of compelling evidence for the possible use of a bioweapon. At this point in 1978, the Rhodesian army was already using bioweapons. They had used cholera to poison a number of wells and water supplies in the area, and were also using chemical weapons to kill hundreds of people.
Right.
So the question is, was this sudden massive anthrax outbreak deliberate and a use of a bioweapon? So, like I said, there's a couple of factors that show that this might actually have been a bioweapon. The first is like the sheer suddenness and scale of the epidemic. It spread so quickly from seemingly nowhere that in several months it covered over 17% of the country. It's actually interesting. Contemporary observers at the time actually said it was as bad as the 1979 Soviet anthrax epidemic, which actually was due to a case of a bioweapon that was released from a research facility.
Right.
Secondly, was the way that the outbreak spread. It had a very unusual spread. Instead of going contagiously, like going from one neighborhood to the next neighborhood to the next neighborhood, it did this odd thing of skipping. It would hop almost 50 kilometers at a time. You'd see it in one town, and then 100 kilometers away, it would suddenly pop up in another town 2 days ago, with none of the areas in between seemingly affected. Thirdly, the epidemic, though it was massive, it was completely and entirely confined to Rhodesia itself. Not a single case of anthrax happened in any of the other surrounding countries. And kind of going into the first 2 points before this, the epidemic, it seemed almost targeted specifically against African communities. 17,000 human cases of anthrax, and not a single one happened to a white Rhodesian. It all happened to rural African Rhodesians. Even in cattle, there were approximately 1 million cattle deaths, and only 11 of those cattle were European owned. The vast, vast, vast majority of that cattle belonged to African populations. In traditional African culture of this area, cattle were a massive indicator of economic wealth and security. So losing this much cattle to the African population was extremely devastating, both from an economic and just from a social point of view. And there were even some anecdotal reports at this time of government airplanes dropping a mysterious white powder on pastures that some people reported seeing directly before the anthrax outbreak. So those are like the main reasons that people cite when they believe that this was a targeted bioweapon release. And I have to say, some of these reasons are pretty compelling, especially the way that the disease hopped from place to place.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let me ask you the same question about the theories and facts that say the epidemic was due to a natural outbreak, because as you mentioned, Rhodesia is endemic for anthrax.
Mm-hmm.
So make the cases there.
So the cases there, I'll give you my final thoughts at the end, but I think the cases for it being a natural outbreak are just as compelling.
Yeah.
So like you said, before the war, anthrax was endemic to Rhodesia. The colony had dealt with anthrax actually very effectively for decades. Before the war, the colony had pretty much the best veterinary system on the entire continent. But with the outbreak of the conflict, they lost any sort of semblance of veterinary controls. Anthrax exploded, but that was not the only disease to explode. Tick-borne diseases, rabies, African sleeping sickness, and even the CC fly exploded hundreds of percentages. Rural areas with large African populations were also the most likely to lose access to these veterinary services, just because the government consolidated its resources on the white owned lands, and clinics were also often targeted by guerrilla forces. So by 1979, out of a couple hundred of cattle dips, these were these machines that they used to help inoculate cattle against diseases, only a tiny percentage of those were still functioning, and the vast majority of those were on the European farms. So previous like routine procedures against endemic anthrax that the government had effectively used for generations, from vaccinating livestock to setting up quarantines to even burning infected animal carcasses, they became utterly impossible as the war dragged on. But while this became almost impossible on African farms, the white-owned European farms only had 11 cases of bovine anthrax. And I believe that this was because they still had excellent veterinary care, they had plenty of resources, more funding in general, and were able to properly care for their herds with greater protection of resources. Which seems to explain why African-owned cattle were so much more vulnerable than European-owned cattle. And since most of the cases of anthrax came from people being infected by cattle, that meant that the African populations were thus more vulnerable to the anthrax as well. This actually also tied in with Operation Turkey. So during the war, as I mentioned earlier, Rhodesian forces did programs such as Operation Turkey, which they were designed to limit food supplies to guerrilla fighters, which ultimately also just led to massive starvation amongst rural African population. So they deliberately limited stockpiles of food. They initiated strict wartime rationings. They destroyed granaries, other food supplies as well. So by 1979, up to 29% of the population was experiencing malnutrition. So what do you do when there's nothing to eat? Well, you eat whatever you can.
Right.
And in this case, that led to consumption of a lot of these anthrax infected cattle. In a typical rural area at this time, usually a single butchered cow could feed about 20 families, which would expose over 100 people to anthrax if that cattle was infected. So, as consumption of cattle became a huge source of food for these starving populations, consumption of anthrax tainted beef also became a huge source of anthrax infection. And once again, this was something that the European population was less vulnerable to. They had more food, they had more resources, they didn't need to consume this anthrax infected cattle. This also actually ties into the unusual hops that the disease showed when it would skip from one community to another.
Mhm.
With the ban on food and the significant malnutrition, illegal smuggling of food, especially tainted beef, became more common between different African communities. So you'd have an outbreak in one region where some cattle would have anthrax. People would butcher and consume the cattle there, but then they'd also smuggle infected meat to sell to another African community 50 kilometers down the road, which would cause another outbreak of anthrax, and so on and so on and so on. There's also some evidence that there may have been some transmission of the anthrax due to a big explosion of fly populations. Um, the research is not as thorough here, but it looks like anthrax can actually be transmitted by biting flies. And with the collapse of veterinary services, fly populations exploded. People who are outside more often were more likely to get bit, more transmission of anthrax. And last but not least, the anthrax itself in this outbreak was very unremarkable. There was no special properties about it, nothing to indicate that it was a bioweapon. It was actually easy to treat if the patients could get to a hospital in time. Like none of the medical staff caring for these people got infected. There was no cross transmission. And once they actually got to the hospital, like most people actually survived, which I think also kind of suggests that this was not really any sort of bioweapon release. The anthrax itself was very treatable once you could get to a facility.
Before I get into ask you about your personal opinion on this, um, what do we know about the other detrimental effects like the economic devastation? That is there a dollars and cents number on this, or what do we know? Do we know anything?
Dollars and cents is difficult to estimate. Beef was a huge part of the Rhodesian economy, which was actually apparently there are reports at one point of the war, Rhodesian High Command did consider using anthrax, but they actually ruled it out specifically because they realized it could have such a detrimental effect on the cattle population. That being said, it seemed like I mentioned it predominantly affected African communities, and a lot of these cattle were used for more like subsistence farming as opposed to commercial farming. So it's difficult to estimate the true economic devastation, but over 1 million head of cattle died during this epidemic. In some communities, this was 90% of the herds available. And this was a huge source of wealth for many of these communities. I think depending on where you were in Rhodesia, this could, even if no one you knew died, this could completely devastate your life forever.
All right, so let's go ahead and close with this. You did all the research to write this paper. You've had chats with Dr. Cross. In your opinion, Dr. Turner, was this, do you think it was due to biological warfare or a natural phenomena due to the war in general, right? Because, go ahead.
So ultimately, I think at the end of the day, this was a purely natural phenomenon that was just exacerbated by the war. From a military standpoint, an anthrax bioweapon would make no sense from Rhodesia's perspective. There's too much of a risk that it would infect the cattle that were a huge part of the nation's economy. From a disease standpoint, you can explain the anthrax through a combination of a malnourished population, food smuggling, a total breakdown in veterinary services. It was also endemic to the area, and the actual anthrax in the epidemic was not anything particularly special and was relatively easy to treat. And finally, there's no physical evidence whatsoever for any sort of anthrax bioweapon. No facilities, no documentation, nothing. Just rumors and pretty anecdotal, flimsy, just reports. In contrast, for the rest of the chemical and biological warfare that Rhodesia engaged in, we do have documentation, we do have physical evidence, but we have absolutely nothing to corroborate an anthrax bioweapon release.
Okay, fair enough. Any final thoughts?
Final thoughts.
Anything we didn't discuss already? Yeah.
I would just say I think that this is a very interesting little period in history. While there is no evidence that anthrax was used as a bioweapon, the Rhodesians did extensively use chemical and biological weapons in this conflict. And Dr. Cross discusses this extensively in his book as well. But I think the fact that such a tiny, impoverished, and resource-strapped regime, pretty much on the verge of collapse, was able to so effectively and secretively mount such a horrific program is something that we should take a warning from and be aware of moving into the future.
Yeah, it was clearly it was a very brutal, brutal time. There's no doubt about that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Let me go ahead and again introduce to the audience your paper. It's entitled "The Rhodesian Anthrax Epidemic: A Case for Biological Warfare?" And it's published at Cureus. And I'll put the link in the show notes when I publish the podcast. And by the way, wonderful article. I enjoyed it immensely, Dr. Turner. And I want to thank you, Dr. Matthew Turner, for this fascinating account in medical and African history. Appreciate it, sir.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great.
You bet.